Never celebrate your 27th birthday during the day. It was a scream that froze the air. The villagers rushed to the market square, their hearts pounding, feet kicking up red dust. There, in the middle of the crowd, lay the lifeless body of Amarachi. Her eyes were wide open, staring into a sky she would never see again. Her 27th birthday feast was still spread out before her, untouched except for the goblet of palm wine that had spilled across the table. People whispered in hushed tones, the question heavy in their minds. What kind of curse had befallen her? Her mother wailed louder than anyone else, clutching her wrapper as though it could shield her from the horror before her. The elder, Baba Kola, stepped forward, his walking stick tapping the earth like the rhythm of doom. "We warned her," he muttered. "Never celebrate your 27th birthday during the day." The crowd gasped. A warning had been ignored. A tradition had been broken. Amarachi had paid the price.
But why? And how?
The answer seemed buried under layers of fear and secrets, but the villagers could feel it in their bones. This was far from over. Amarachi had always been different. Born to a modest family in the small village of Umwahia, she was the light of her mother's life. Her father had died when she was a child, leaving her mother to raise her alone. Despite their struggles, Amarachi had grown up full of life and curiosity. She often helped her mother on the farm, singing songs that made even the laziest crops seem to grow faster. As she grew older, Amarachi's beauty became the talk of the village. Her skin was as smooth as freshly pounded yam, her eyes sparkled like morning dew, and her smile could calm the angriest hearts. Suitors lined up to win her favor, but Amarachi was focused on her dreams. She wanted more than the simple life of the village. She wanted to travel, to see the world beyond the red roads and thick forests of Umwahia. Amarachi had heard the stories about the curse of 27 from her grandmother when she was just a child. Every so often, a young woman in the village who celebrated her 27th birthday during the day would meet a mysterious and untimely end. Nobody knew why, and nobody dared to challenge it. It was said that the spirits of the forest, the ones who watched over the village, disapproved of daylight celebrations for reasons lost to time. When Amarachi turned 26, her mother warned her, "Next year, you must listen to the elders. Celebrate at night, or not at all." Amarachi had laughed it off. She didn't believe in old superstitions. "Mama," she said, "do you really think spirits care what time I celebrate my birthday? It's just a story." Her mother had frowned, but said no more. Amarachi's stubbornness was as strong as the Harmattan wind. As her 27th birthday approached, Amarachi decided she would throw the biggest celebration Umwahia had ever seen. She invited everyone, family, friends, neighbors, even strangers passing through. She wanted it to be a feast to remember, a day filled with dancing, laughter, and joy. The morning of her birthday was perfect. The sun shone brightly, the air was warm but not stifling, and the smell of jollof rice, roasted chicken, and fried plantains filled the air. Amarachi wore a flowing blue gown that made her look like royalty. Guests arrived in droves, bringing gifts and well wishes. The village square buzzed with excitement. But as the day wore on, strange things began to happen. A child playing near the edge of the forest ran back screaming, claiming he saw a shadowy figure watching him. The drums that had been beating so joyously suddenly fell silent, as though unseen hands had stopped them. And then the wind changed. It became cold, biting, carrying with it a scent that made people's stomachs churn. Amarachi noticed none of this. She was too busy laughing, dancing, and enjoying her day. When someone mentioned the strange occurrences, she waved them off. "It's just the wind playing tricks," she said. As the sun reached its peak in the sky, Amarachi raised her goblet of palm wine to make a toast. She stood on the wooden platform in the center of the square, her voice ringing out with joy. "To life, love, and the future," she declared. The crowd cheered, but their joy was short-lived. A loud crack echoed through the air, like the sound of a tree splitting in two. The platform beneath Amarachi gave way, and she tumbled to the ground. Gasps filled the square as people rushed to help her. At first, it seemed she was unharmed, just shaken. But then her face contorted in pain, and she clutched her chest. "It burns," she whispered. Her voice was faint, her breath shallow. Before anyone could understand what was happening, she collapsed. Now, hours later, her lifeless body lay before them. The elders whispered amongst themselves, the younger villagers looked on in fear, and her mother cried until she had no more tears left. Somewhere in the distance, the forest seemed to sigh, as though satisfied. The curse of 27 had claimed another victim, but Amarachi's story was far from over. What had caused her death? And what price would the village pay for this tragedy? As the sun set and the villagers began to leave the square, they could feel it. The spirits were restless, and they were not done with Umwahia. As night fell over Umwahia, the once vibrant village became eerily silent. Even the crickets, usually loud and persistent, seemed to hold their breath. The elders gathered in Baba Kola's compound, their faces grim. The fire in the middle of the room flickered, casting long, uneasy shadows on the walls. "We must act quickly," Baba Kola said, his voice heavy with urgency. "The spirits have been angered. This is not the end. It is only the beginning." "What can we do, Baba?" asked Namdi, the village blacksmith. His hands, usually steady and strong, trembled as he spoke. "Amarachi is already gone. How can we make things right?" "The spirits must be appeased," Baba Kola replied. "But this time, it will not be simple." Amarachi ignored the warnings, and now her death has opened a doorway, one that should never have been unlocked. The elders nodded in agreement, their faces etched with worry. None of them wanted to voice the fear that sat heavy in their hearts. The curse of 27 was no longer just a legend. It was real, and it was here. Meanwhile, in the small hut where Amarachi's body lay, her mother, Adan, refused to leave her side. She sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers to the ancestors. The room was dark except for a single lantern that cast a dim, golden glow over Amarachi's lifeless form. "Mama, please come home," begged Chisholm, Amarachi's younger cousin. "You need to rest." "I cannot leave her," Adan replied, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. "She is my daughter, my only child. I will stay here until the spirits themselves come to take her away." As the words left her mouth, a chill swept through the room, causing the lantern to flicker. Chisholm gasped and stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. "Mama, did you feel that?" Adan did not answer. Her gaze was fixed on Amarachi's face. For a moment, she thought she saw her daughter's lips move. It was so faint, she convinced herself it was her imagination. But then it happened again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Amarachi's lips were moving, as though she were trying to speak. "Amarachi?" Adan whispered, leaning closer. Her heart raced. "My child, is that you?" A faint, raspy sound escaped Amarachi's mouth. It was impossible to make out the words, but it was enough to send Adan into a frenzy. "Chisholm, fetch Baba Kola."
"Now."
Chisholm hesitated, her fear rooting her to the spot. "Mama, what if?" "Go," Adan shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. Chisholm bolted out the door, her feet pounding against the dirt as she ran toward Baba Kola's compound. Adan turned back to Amarachi, her hands trembling as she gently touched her daughter's face. "Speak to me, my child. Tell me what you need." Amarachi's lips moved again, and this time, Adan heard it clearly. A single word, whispered so faintly it was almost lost to the air. "Run." Before Adan could process the warning, the lantern flickered violently and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the air became heavy, almost suffocating. Adan felt a presence in the room, something cold, something otherworldly. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. There was no answer, only the sound of rustling, like leaves moving in a wind that wasn't there. And then, from the corner of the room, she saw it, a pair of glowing red eyes staring at her. Adan screamed, stumbling backward. The eyes moved closer, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down her spine. "Leave us alone," she cried, clutching her wrapper tightly around her. Just as the glowing eyes seemed to reach her, the door burst open, flooding the room with light. Chisholm had returned with Baba Cola and several other villagers. The glowing eyes vanished instantly, leaving the room as still and silent as a graveyard.
What happened?
Baba Cola asked, his sharp eyes scanning the room. She spoke. Adan stammered, pointing to Amarachi's body. "She told me to run. And then something was here. It had eyes like fire." Baba Cola stepped closer to Amarachi's body, his walking stick tapping the floor with each step. He muttered a prayer under his breath, then placed his hand on Amarachi's forehead. The room seemed to hold its breath. "She is caught between worlds," Baba Cola said finally, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Her soul cannot rest, because the spirits are still angry. We must act now, or her fate will become ours." The next morning, the entire village gathered in the square. Baba Cola stood in the center, his presence commanding and grave. "The curse of 27 is upon us," he announced. "And it will not stop with Amarachi. Unless we find a way to appease the spirits, more lives will be lost." "What do they want?" someone shouted from the crowd. "They want respect," Baba Cola replied. "They want the old ways to be honored." Amarachi's celebration was a defiance of their will, and now we all must pay the price. "Then what do we do?" asked another voice. Baba Cola took a deep breath. "There is a ritual," he said, "but it is dangerous. It requires a sacrifice." The crowd erupted in murmurs. A sacrifice? The very word sent chills down their spines. Who would be willing to give their life to save the village? Before anyone could speak, a loud scream pierced the air. It came from the direction of the forest. The crowd turned as one, their eyes wide with fear. The scream was followed by another and then another. Baba Cola's face darkened.
"It has begun," he said.
"The spirits are calling." The villagers stood frozen, their feet rooted to the ground. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the forest. It was a young man, his clothes torn and his face pale with terror. He stumbled into the square, clutching his side as though he had been wounded. "They're coming," he gasped, collapsing to the ground. "The spirits, they're coming." And then, before anyone could react, the drums began to beat again. Not the joyous rhythm of celebration, but a slow, ominous thrum that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. The drums grew louder, each beat reverberating through the hearts of the villagers. They turned toward the forest, where the sound seemed to originate. Shadows danced among the trees, moving unnaturally, as if alive. Baba Cola raised his walking stick, his voice booming over the panicked murmurs. "Silence. Stand your ground." The villagers huddled closer, their fear palpable. The young man who had stumbled out of the forest lay motionless on the ground, his shallow breathing the only sign he was still alive. Adan, standing at the edge of the crowd, clutched her wrapper tightly and stared into the woods, her mind racing. Amarachi had warned her to run. Was this what her daughter had foreseen? Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the forest, like the snapping of a giant branch. The shadows grew darker, spreading across the ground like ink in water. From within the trees emerged a figure, a tall, slender being cloaked in darkness, its face obscured but its presence overwhelming. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence fell over the square as the drums abruptly stopped. Baba Cola stepped forward, his walking stick tapping the ground with authority.
"Who are you?"
"What do you want?" he demanded. The figure tilted its head, as if considering his question. When it spoke, its voice was low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "The pact has been broken," it said. "The debt must be paid." "What debt?" Baba Cola asked, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "The debt of respect," the figure replied. "The woman who defied us has opened the door. The balance must be restored, or your village will wither like leaves in the harmattan." The villagers whispered among themselves, their fear turning to desperation. Baba Cola raised his hand to quiet them. "We will do what is necessary to restore the balance," he said. Tell us what you require. The figure extended a long, shadowy arm toward the villagers. Its finger, impossibly sharp and pointed, moved as though searching. When it stopped, it was aimed directly at Adan. You, the figure said, the mother of the defiant one. You will carry the burden. Adan's heart sank. She took a step back, her legs trembling. Me? What do you mean? She stammered. The sins of the child are the burden of the parent, the figure intoned. You must enter the forest and complete the ritual. Only then will the spirits be satisfied. What happens if she refuses? Someone in the crowd asked, their voice barely above a whisper. The figure turned its head slowly toward the speaker. Refusal means death. For all of you. The crowd erupted in panic. Mothers clutched their children, men gripped their farming tools as though they could defend themselves against the supernatural. Baba Kola raised his voice again, calling for calm. We will not survive if we act out of fear, he said. Let us think this through. Adan's mind was a whirlwind. She thought of Amarachi, lying cold and lifeless in the hut. She thought of the village, the people she had known all her life. Could she bear the weight of their lives on her shoulders? But then she thought of the warning Amarachi had whispered. Run. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. I will do it, she said. Tell me what the ritual requires. The figure tilted its head again, as if amused by her bravery. Enter the forest when the moon is at its peak, it said. You will find a clearing with a single tree. There, you will receive further instructions. Come alone. Or, without another word, the figure dissolved into shadows, and the forest grew still. The drums did not start again, but the weight of their absence was just as oppressive. The hours leading up to midnight felt like an eternity. Adan prepared herself in silence, tying her wrapper securely and gathering a small pouch of charms blessed by the village priest. Chisholm begged her not to go, tears streaming down her face. Mama, you can't. What if they take you too? She cried. Adan cupped her face gently. If I don't go, they will take all of us, she said. I have to do this for Amarachi and for the village. Baba Kola visited her before she left, placing a hand on her shoulder. You are brave, he said. Remember, the spirits respect courage. Show no fear, no matter what you face. As the moon rose high in the sky, Adan made her way to the edge of the forest. The village was deathly quiet, the only sound her footsteps on the dry, cracked earth. She paused at the tree line, taking a deep breath before stepping into the darkness. The forest was alive with sounds, branches creaking, leaves rustling, animals scurrying unseen. But there was something unnatural about it. The sounds seemed to echo in strange ways, as though the forest itself was whispering secrets. Adan walked cautiously, her eyes scanning every shadow. The path was faint, overgrown with roots and vines, but she followed it as best she could. After what felt like hours, she emerged into a clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted, its branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. A low hum filled the air, and the shadows around the clearing began to move. From the base of the tree, the same figure emerged, its presence as unsettling as before. You have come, it said. Good. The ritual begins now. Adan stepped closer, her hands trembling but her head held high. What must I do? The figure raised its arm and pointed to the tree. Cut a branch from the tree and carve into it the name of the Defiant One. Offer it to the earth with your blood. Adan hesitated. My blood? Only a mother's sacrifice can close the door that was opened, the figure replied. Do this, and the balance will be restored. Adan approached the tree, her heart pounding. She reached for a branch, her fingers brushing its rough bark. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the clearing, and the tree shuddered violently. Adan stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. From the base of the tree, something began to emerge, roots twisting and writhing, forming the shape of a face. Its eyes opened, glowing red, and its mouth split into a wide, menacing grin. You should not have come, it said, its voice deep and echoing. Now it is too late. The ground beneath Adan's feet began to tremble, and the shadows around the clearing grew darker, closing in. She froze, her mind racing. Had she made a terrible mistake? The tremors beneath Adan's feet grew stronger, sending cracks through the earth like jagged veins. The tree's twisted face leaned closer, its glowing red eyes boring into her soul. "The defiance of one has doomed you all," it hissed, its voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Your offering is not enough." Adan clutched the branch in her hand, her knuckles white with fear. "You said the ritual would restore balance," she shouted, her voice trembling. "I'm doing what you asked." The tree's face contorted into something that might have been a smirk. "The price has changed." Before Adan could respond, the shadows around the clearing surged forward, wrapping around her ankles like cold, black tendrils. She gasped, stumbling backward as they pulled her toward the tree. "Let me go," she cried, struggling against their grip. The figure of shadow reappeared, towering over her. "The defiance has angered the Ancient Ones," it said. "The ritual must now claim not one, but 2 lives. You will finish your task, and you will choose another to join you." Adan's blood ran cold. "Another? No, I cannot." "You will," the figure interrupted, its voice sharp and unyielding. "Or the village will perish." Adan's mind raced. She thought of Chisholm, of Baba Kola, of the countless innocent lives that would be lost if she refused. But the thought of choosing someone else to share her fate was unbearable. "You have until the next sunrise," the figure said, stepping back into the shadows. "Finish the ritual and choose." The tendrils released her, and she fell to the ground, gasping for air. The clearing grew quiet again, but the sense of foreboding remained. Adan looked up at the tree, its gnarled branches swaying as though taunting her. She gripped the branch in her hand, her resolve hardening. If she was to do this, she would need to think carefully. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a millstone. As Adan made her way back to the village, the forest seemed darker than before. The path twisted unnaturally, as though the forest was trying to confuse her. She whispered prayers under her breath, clutching the branch tightly as she walked. When she finally emerged from the forest, the village was eerily quiet. No one greeted her. No one was outside their homes. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next move. She went straight to Baba Kola's compound, her heart pounding. When he opened the door, his face was drawn and tired, as though he already knew what had transpired. "They want more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ritual is not enough. They demand another life." Baba Kola's expression darkened. He gestured for her to sit by the fire, where a pot of herbs brewed, filling the air with a bitter scent. "Tell me everything." Adan recounted what had happened in the clearing, the tree, the shadowy figure, the demand for another sacrifice. Baba Kola listened intently, his face betraying no emotion. "They have grown more vengeful than I feared," he said when she finished. "This is no longer about Amarachi's defiance. The spirits are testing us, pushing us to the brink." "What do I do, Baba?" Adan asked, her voice trembling. "How can I choose someone to share my fate?" Baba Kola leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "You must think carefully. This choice is not just about who will accompany you. It is about the kind of sacrifice that will satisfy the spirits. Sometimes, the right choice is not the most obvious one." Adan stared into the fire, her mind spinning. How could she make such a decision? Who could she possibly choose? The next morning, the village gathered in the square again. The tension was thick, the fear in the air palpable. Baba Kola stood at the center, his walking stick firmly planted in the ground. "The spirits have spoken," he announced. "Adan has returned from the forest with a grave message. The ritual requires another sacrifice. If we do not comply, the spirits will destroy us all." The crowd erupted in panic. Cries of despair and anger filled the air as villagers shouted over one another. Some cursed Amarachi for bringing this curse upon them. Others begged for mercy, tears streaming down their faces. "Enough!" Baba Kola shouted, raising his hand. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. We do not have time for blame or fear. Adan will complete the ritual tonight. But the second sacrifice must be chosen. Adan stepped forward, her heart pounding. She felt every pair of eyes on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. I cannot do this alone, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. I need your help. The villagers exchanged nervous glances. No one dared to speak, afraid that volunteering, or even speaking up, might seal their fate. Then, to everyone's surprise, a voice broke the silence. I will go. The crowd turned to see Namdi, the village blacksmith, stepping forward. His face was solemn, but there was no fear in his eyes. If my life will save the village, then so be it. Adan's breath caught in her throat. Namdi, no. You have a family. They will understand, he said, cutting her off. He looked at her, his gaze steady. This is not your burden alone, Adan. Let me help you carry it. Baba Kola nodded approvingly. Your courage honors us all, Namdi. The villagers murmured in disbelief, but no one else stepped forward to challenge his decision. Adan's heart ached as she looked at Namdi, knowing what lay ahead. As the sun set, Adan and Namdi prepared for their journey back to the forest. The villagers gathered to see them off, their faces a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. Adan embraced Chisholm tightly, tears streaming down her face. Be strong, my child, she whispered. No matter what happens, remember that I love you. Chisholm clung to her, sobbing. Mama, please don't go. But Adan had no choice. She and Namdi set off into the forest, the weight of their task heavier with each step. The path seemed darker, the air colder, as though the forest itself was anticipating their arrival. When they reached the clearing, the massive tree stood waiting, its twisted branches casting long shadows in the moonlight. The shadowy figure appeared once more, its presence as oppressive as ever. You have returned, it said, its voice filled with dark satisfaction. And you have brought the second sacrifice. Adan and Namdi exchanged a glance, their resolve unspoken but firm. They stepped forward together, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Begin the ritual, the figure commanded, its red eyes glowing brighter. And remember, the spirits are watching. As Adan lifted the branch to carve Amarachi's name, the ground beneath them began to tremble again. The tree's roots twisted and writhed, and the face in the bark split into a wide grin. You think this will end with you, it said, its voice echoing with malevolent glee. Fools. The door has been opened, and it cannot be closed. The clearing erupted in chaos as the shadows surged forward, consuming everything in their path. Adan screamed, clutching Namdi's hand as the darkness closed in. The shadows surged like a living tide, their cold tendrils wrapping around Adan and Namdi. The oppressive darkness swallowed the clearing, leaving no trace of moonlight or stars. Adan gripped Namdi's hand tightly, her mind racing with prayers and thoughts of her daughter. The tree's grin widened, its voice rumbling through the air. The ritual begins, but the end is far from near. Adan's voice trembled as she shouted, You promised. You said the ritual would restore balance. The tree's laughter was low and menacing. Did I? Or did you assume too much? The ground beneath them cracked open, and the forest floor seemed to collapse into itself. Adan and Namdi were pulled downward, their screams echoing in the void. They landed with a jarring thud on a surface that felt unnervingly soft, like flesh. Adan struggled to her feet, her legs shaking as she looked around. They were no longer in the forest. They stood in a cavernous space with walls that pulsed as if alive. The air was thick and damp, carrying the stench of decay. In the distance, a faint, eerie glow illuminated a path that seemed to lead deeper into the unknown. What is this place? Namdi whispered, his voice barely audible. The heart of the spirit's domain, a voice answered. It wasn't the shadowy figure or the tree, but something else, something ancient and cold. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Adan's chest tightened. What do you want from us? She demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. The voice chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. What we want has already begun. You are here to complete what your daughter started. The ritual is no longer about balance. It is about survival. Namdi stepped forward, his fists clenched. We won't play your games. If you want to take our lives, then do it and leave the village alone. The voice grew darker, angrier. You misunderstand. This is not a choice. This is penance. And your suffering will pave the way for others to understand the cost of defiance. The glow in the distance intensified, casting long shadows that danced along the pulsating walls. Adan and Namdi exchanged a glance, their fear evident, but their resolve unbroken. We move forward, Adan said, her voice steady. Namdi nodded. Together, the path twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the cavern. The glow grew brighter, revealing grotesque shapes embedded in the walls, faces frozen in expressions of agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Adan averted her eyes, but the faint whispers of the trapped souls filled her ears. Why do they suffer? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They are the forgotten, Namdi replied grimly. Those who failed to appease the spirits. Adan swallowed hard, her resolve wavering for the first time. But she pushed forward, knowing there was no turning back. The path eventually opened into a massive chamber. In the center stood an altar made of twisted roots and bones. A shallow bowl carved from stone rested atop the altar, filled with a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to ripple despite the still air. The shadowy figure reappeared, its form more solid and menacing than before. You have arrived, it said. The final step is here. Adan stepped forward, her hands trembling. What must we do? The figure gestured toward the bowl. Place the branch in the offering and let your blood join hers. Only then will the spirits decide your fate. Adan hesitated, staring at the dark liquid. Hers? Do you mean Amarachi? She is part of this now, the figure said. Her spirit lingers because of your defiance. End this, and she may find peace. Adan's breath caught in her throat. Her daughter's soul was trapped here, bound by the anger of the spirits. She reached for the branch, her resolve hardening. If this was the only way to save Amarachi, she would do it. Before she could act, Namdi grabbed her arm.
Wait, he said.
How do we know this isn't another trick? They've lied before. The shadowy figure's eyes glowed brighter. Questioning the spirits is dangerous. Act, or face the consequences. Adan looked at Namdi, then at the bowl. She could feel the weight of the village's fate on her shoulders, as well as her daughter's soul. She gritted her teeth and stepped forward, clutching the branch tightly. She plunged the branch into the bowl, and the liquid hissed as if alive. The chamber trembled, and the glow intensified, blinding her momentarily. She felt a sharp pain as the shadowy figure's tendrils wrapped around her wrist, pulling her hand toward the bowl. Your blood, it demanded. Adan cried out as a thin line of crimson appeared on her palm, her blood dripping into the bowl. The liquid roared to life, swirling and rising into the air like a living storm. Faces formed within it. Mama, Amarachi's voice whispered, faint but clear. It's not over. The liquid surged upward, engulfing the altar and spreading through the chamber. The walls began to collapse, and the whispers of the trapped souls turned into deafening screams. Namdi grabbed Adan, pulling her away from the altar as the ground shook violently. We need to get out of here, he shouted. Adan's eyes were fixed on the swirling liquid, on the faint image of her daughter's face. Amarachi, she screamed. The chamber exploded with light, and everything went black. When Adan opened her eyes, she was back in the village square. The sun was rising, casting warm, golden light over the huts and trees. She sat up, her head spinning, and looked around. Namdi was beside her, unconscious but breathing. The villagers began to gather, their faces a mix of relief and confusion. Baba Kola approached, his walking stick tapping against the ground. You have returned, he said, his voice filled with awe. What happened? Adan opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She looked down at her hands, which still bore the faint marks of the ritual. Before she could answer, a low, ominous hum filled the air. The villagers froze, their eyes widening in fear. From the edge of the forest, the shadows began to move. The shadows slithered like liquid darkness, oozing out from the forest's edge. They moved with purpose, stretching toward the village square. The villagers gasped and scrambled back, their fear mounting as the tendrils of shadow began to weave through the huts, dimming the morning sun. Adan stood frozen, her heart racing. She grabbed Namdi's arm, shaking him awake. "Namdi, get up. They're here." Namdi groaned, his head lolling to the side before his eyes shot open. He sat up quickly, scanning the scene. The shadows were no longer lurking at the periphery. They were advancing rapidly, their presence suffocating. Baba Kola stepped forward, his walking stick raised as he began to chant an incantation. His voice, firm and melodic, seemed to momentarily halt the encroaching darkness. The shadows recoiled, but only briefly. "They are not satisfied," Baba Kola shouted over the rising panic. The ritual did not complete the bond. It only awakened something far worse. Adan's stomach dropped. The shadowy figure's words in the cavern came flooding back. "The door has been opened, and it cannot be closed." "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Baba Kola turned to her, his face grave. "It means the spirit's anger has evolved. They no longer want sacrifice, they want dominion." The villagers cried out in despair, their fear turning into chaos. Some fled toward the forest, while others knelt in prayer, clutching their charms and muttering desperate pleas to the ancestors. Namdi grabbed Adan's arm, pulling her closer. "We need to get everyone out of here. If the spirits want the village, we can't stay." Baba Kola shook his head. "Running will not save us. The shadows will follow wherever we go. The only hope is to face them."
"How?"
Adan asked, tears brimming in her eyes. "We did everything they asked, and it still wasn't enough." Baba Kola lowered his voice, his expression heavy with sorrow. "There is one last option, but it requires a great cost." "What cost?" Namdi demanded. "The spirits demand a bond with the living," Baba Kola said. "A life bound to their service in eternal servitude. If one among us agrees, the shadows will be satisfied, and the village will be spared." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The villagers exchanged horrified glances, no one daring to speak. The idea of a life spent in service to the spirits, trapped between worlds, was worse than death itself. Adan stepped forward, her chest heaving with the weight of the decision. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "No," Namdi said, grabbing her arm. "You've sacrificed enough. If anyone should go, it's me." Adan shook her head, her resolve unshaken. "Amarachi was my daughter. This started because of me. I can't let anyone else pay the price." Baba Kola placed a hand on her shoulder. "The choice must be freely made," he said. "The spirits will only accept a willing servant." Adan looked at the villagers, at their frightened faces and trembling hands. She thought of Chisholm, of the life she would leave behind. But she also thought of the lives she could save.
"I am willing," she said.
The shadows stopped their advance, coiling around the village square like a serpent waiting to strike. The air grew still, heavy with anticipation. The shadowy figure emerged once more, its glowing eyes fixed on Adan. "You have made your choice," it said, its voice echoing with finality. "Step forward." Adan's legs felt like lead as she moved toward the figure. The villagers watched in silence, their fear palpable. Baba Kola began to chant again, his words blending with the hum of the shadows. As Adan reached the center of the square, the figure extended its tendrils toward her. "Do you swear to serve the spirits for eternity?" it asked. "I swear," Adan said, her voice unwavering. The tendrils wrapped around her wrists, pulling her closer. The ground beneath her began to glow with an eerie light, and the shadows spiraled upward, enveloping her in darkness. She gasped as a searing pain shot through her body, as though her very soul was being pulled apart. "Mama!" Chisholm's voice rang out, breaking through the chaos. Adan turned her head, her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter running toward her. "No, Chisholm. Stay back," Adan shouted. But it was too late. Chisholm reached the edge of the glowing circle and was immediately thrown back by an invisible force. She landed in a heap, crying out in pain. Adan turned back to the figure. "Please," she begged. "Spare her. Spare the village." The figure tilted its head, as if considering her plea. "Your bond will protect them," it said. "But the cost is permanent. There will be no return." "I understand," Adan said, her voice trembling. "Just let them live." The figure raised its arm, and the shadows surged forward, engulfing Adan completely. Her screams echoed through the square as the villagers watched helplessly. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The shadows receded, the air grew warm again, and the village was bathed in the light of the rising sun. But Adan was gone. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the empty space where Adan had been. Baba Kola lowered his walking stick, his face etched with sorrow. "She has saved us," he said softly. "Her sacrifice will be remembered for generations." Chisholm ran to the center of the square, falling to her knees. Tears streamed down her face as she cried out, "Mama." Namdi placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening with tears.
"She did it for you," he said.
"For all of us." The village was safe, but at a terrible cost. And though the shadows had receded, a sense of unease lingered. The villagers knew the spirits were never truly gone. They had taken what they wanted, but for how long? As the morning sun rose higher, its warmth chasing away the remnants of the night, the forest seemed to sigh, as if satisfied, for now the village returned to its routine, but life was far from normal. The square, once a place of joy and gatherings, now the villagers whispered about Adan's sacrifice, their voices tinged with gratitude and guilt. Though the shadows had disappeared, an uneasy quiet blanketed Umwahia, as if the spirits were still watching. Chisholm rarely left the hut. She spent her days staring at the place where her mother had vanished, tears staining her cheeks. Namdi visited often, bringing food and sitting with her in silence. He too felt the weight of Adan's absence, the guilt of knowing he had let her go alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a loud crack echoed through the village. Chisholm flinched, her heart racing. She ran outside, where the villagers were gathering, their faces etched with fear. "It's coming from the forest," one of them said, pointing toward the dark line of trees. Baba Kola arrived moments later, his walking stick in hand. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice firm. "Do not go near the forest." "What's happening?" Chisholm asked, her voice shaking. Baba Kola's face was grim. "The spirits are restless. The bond has been made, but something is wrong." Chisholm's stomach churned. Her mother had sacrificed everything. Was it not enough? That night, the dreams began. Chisholm woke in a cold sweat, her mother's voice echoing in her ears. "Chisholm, come to me," the voice whispered, faint but unmistakable. She sat up, her heart pounding. Was it real? Or was her grief playing tricks on her? The dreams continued over the following nights, growing more vivid. Each time, she saw her mother standing at the edge of the forest, her arms outstretched. "Chisholm, I need you," the voice pleaded. Unable to bear it any longer, Chisholm went to Baba Kola. "She's calling me," she said, her voice trembling. "I hear her every night." "What does it mean?" Baba Kola's face darkened. "The bond has not settled. Your mother's spirit is trapped between worlds. She is neither here nor with the spirits." "Then how do we help her?" Chisholm asked, desperation in her voice. Baba Kola sighed deeply. "To free her, we must understand why the spirits are still restless. This is not a task for the faint of heart." "I'll do whatever it takes," Chisholm said firmly. "She saved us. I won't abandon her." Baba Kola nodded. "Then we must return to the forest." Namdi insisted on joining them, despite Baba Kola's warnings. "If there's a chance to bring Adan peace, I will help," he said. The three of them ventured into the forest under the cover of darkness. The air was heavy, the trees towering above them like silent sentinels. The path twisted unnaturally, as it had during the ritual, but Baba Cola guided them with certainty. When they reached the clearing, Chisholm gasped. The massive tree stood exactly as it had before, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky. The ground beneath it was scorched, as if the earth itself had been burned by the ritual. The air was thick with an unearthly hum. "She's here," Chisholm whispered, her eyes scanning the clearing. Baba Cola stepped forward, planting his walking stick firmly in the ground. He began to chant, his voice resonating through the air. The hum grew louder, and the shadows began to stir at the edges of the clearing. From the base of the tree, a faint figure emerged. It was Adan, her face pale, and her eyes filled with sorrow. "Chisholm," she said, her voice trembling. "Why did you come?" "Mama," Chisholm cried, running toward her. "Stop!" Baba Cola shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "She is not whole. Stay back." Chisholm froze, tears streaming down her face. "Mama, what's happening? Why are you still here?" Adan's figure flickered, as if struggling to stay solid. "The bond, it's incomplete," she said. "The spirits are angry. They demand more." "What do they want?" Namdi asked, stepping forward. Adan's eyes filled with pain.
"A new bond," she said.
"One stronger than the first. They want Chisholm." "No." Baba Cola roared, slamming his walking stick into the ground. The shadows surged forward, but his chant held them back. "This is not the spirit's will. This is something darker." Adan's figure flickered again, her voice growing faint. "Chisholm, run. Don't let them take you." The ground beneath them began to tremble, cracks forming in the earth. The tree groaned, its branches swaying violently. From the shadows emerged the figure that had overseen the ritual, its red eyes glowing menacingly. "You return uninvited," it said, its voice low and threatening. "The pact was made, but her blood is not enough." Baba Cola raised his walking stick, his voice filled with authority. "We will not give you another. Release her and be gone." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You have no power here, old man. The girl is ours." Before anyone could react, the shadows surged toward Chisholm, wrapping around her like chains. She screamed as they pulled her toward the tree. "Mama," she cried, reaching out desperately. Adan's figure lunged forward, her face contorted with rage.
"No."
"Take me instead." The clearing erupted in chaos. Baba Cola's chants grew louder, his voice straining as he fought against the shadows. Namdi grabbed Chisholm, trying to pull her free, but the shadows tightened their grip. In the midst of the chaos, the tree's face appeared once more, its eyes blazing. "The bond must be sealed," it bellowed. "There is no escape." Adan turned to Chisholm, her eyes filled with tears. "I love you," she whispered. "Be strong." With a sudden burst of light, Adan's figure surged forward, colliding with the shadows. The clearing was consumed in blinding brightness, and the air was filled with an ear-splitting roar. And then, everything went silent. As the blinding light faded, Chisholm collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The clearing was eerily quiet, the oppressive hum and flickering shadows gone. The massive tree stood lifeless, its twisted branches drooping as if the fight had drained it of all its power. Baba Cola and Namdi rushed to her side, their faces etched with worry. "Are you hurt?" Namdi asked, kneeling beside her. Chisholm shook her head, though her body trembled. "Mama, where is she?" The three of them looked toward the center of the clearing. Adan's figure was gone. The tree, once menacing and alive, now looked like any other tree in the forest. The scorched earth around its base was cool, and the air no longer felt thick with malice. "She's not here," Chisholm whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "She saved me, didn't she?" Baba Cola placed a hand on her shoulder, his face heavy with sorrow. "She gave herself completely to protect you. Her spirit confronted the darkness and made the ultimate sacrifice." Namdi frowned, his gaze fixed on the tree. "But if the spirits are appeased, why do I feel like this isn't over?" Baba Cola nodded gravely. You are right to feel uneasy. This quiet is not peace. It is merely a pause. The spirit's anger has been calmed, but only for now. The journey back to the village was somber. Chisholm said nothing, her mind replaying the events in the clearing. She could still hear her mother's voice, see the flicker of her figure standing defiant against the shadows. The image haunted her, filling her with both pride and sorrow. When they reached the village, the sun was just beginning to rise. The villagers, who had been too afraid to leave their homes, emerged cautiously, their faces a mix of relief and apprehension. Baba Kola explained what had happened, his words measured but honest. Adan has given herself to protect us, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. But the spirits are not gone. They have retreated, and their watchful eyes remain. We must honor her sacrifice by living with respect for the old ways. The villagers murmured their agreement, though the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They had seen too much to believe they were truly safe. Over the next few weeks, the village seemed to return to normal, but an undercurrent of unease lingered. The forest, once a source of livelihood and stories, was now avoided entirely. Even the boldest hunters refused to venture near its edges. Chisholm, however, could not stay away. She found herself drawn to the forest, her dreams filled with whispers and shadows. Each night, she heard her mother's voice calling to her, faint but insistent. Chisholm, there is more to be done. One evening, unable to ignore the pull any longer, Chisholm made her way to the forest. She didn't tell anyone, not even Namdi or Baba Kola. She knew they would try to stop her, and she couldn't explain why she felt this was something she had to do alone. The forest was quiet, the path winding and overgrown. Chisholm clutched a small charm Baba Kola had given her, a token of protection, though she wasn't sure it would be enough. As she walked, the air grew colder, and the familiar hum returned, faint but unmistakable. When she reached the clearing, she stopped in her tracks. The tree, which had seemed dead, now pulsed faintly with an eerie light. The ground around its base was cracked, as though something beneath it was trying to break free. Chisholm stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Mama," she called out. The air grew heavy, and the shadows began to stir once more. From the base of the tree, the faint outline of her mother appeared. Figure was translucent, her features pale but recognizable. "Chisholm," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "You should not have come." "I had to," Chisholm replied, tears streaming down her face. "I keep hearing you in my dreams. What's happening? Why are you still here?" Adan's figure flickered, her expression pained. The spirit's anger has shifted, but it has not disappeared. They are bound to this place, and so am I. Their hunger will grow again, and when it does, the village will not survive unless they are truly satisfied. Chisholm's stomach twisted. "What can I do? How do we stop them?" Adan reached out, her hand passing through the air as though trying to touch her daughter. "There is a way, but it is dangerous. The spirits are tied to this tree. Their power flows from its roots. To sever the bond, the tree must be destroyed." Chisholm's eyes widened. "Destroyed? How can we destroy something so powerful?" Adan's figure began to fade, her voice growing faint. "You must find the source of their power, deep beneath the earth. Beware, my child. The spirits will not let you succeed easily."
"No, wait,"
Chisholm cried, reaching out. But her mother's figure dissolved into the air, leaving her alone in the clearing. Chisholm returned to the village, her mind racing. She went straight to Baba Kola's hut, waking him from his restless sleep. Namdi was already there, sitting by the fire. "What is it, child?" Baba Kola asked, his voice weary. Chisholm took a deep breath, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I saw her. My mother. She said the spirits are still bound to the tree, and that we have to destroy it to end this once and for all." Baba Kola's eyes widened. "Destroy the tree? That is no simple task. Its roots are ancient, intertwined with the spirits themselves. She said we have to go deep beneath the earth to find the source of their power," Chisholm continued. "If we can destroy that, The spirits will lose their hold. Namdi frowned, his expression serious. If what she says is true, then we have no choice. But this will be more dangerous than anything we've faced so far. Baba Kola nodded slowly. The spirits will not give up their power willingly. If we fail, the consequences could be catastrophic. Then we can't fail, Chisholm said, her voice firm. We owe it to her, to everyone, to finish this. Baba Kola and Namdi exchanged a glance, their resolve hardening. We'll prepare, Baba Kola said. But be warned, Chisholm. Once we start this journey, there may be no turning back. Chisholm nodded, her heart steady despite the fear swirling inside her. I'm ready. As the three of them began to plan their descent into the unknown, the forest seemed to whisper around them, as if the spirits were already aware of their intentions. The forest loomed large as Baba Kola, Namdi, and Chisholm prepared for their descent. The villagers, though terrified, gathered in the square to see them off. Baba Kola had insisted that the task remain secret. Too many knowing the truth would spread panic. Chisholm carried a small pouch of herbs, charms, and a knife blessed by Baba Kola. Namdi had his machete and a sturdy rope slung over his shoulder. Baba Kola, as always, had his walking stick, now adorned with fresh inscriptions etched into its length. You must come back, an elderly woman whispered to Baba Kola. Without you, we are lost. I will do my best, Baba Kola replied solemnly. But this is not about me. It is about the future of our people. The three ventured into the forest, their hearts heavy but resolute. The villagers watched them disappear into the shadows, their prayers following like whispers on the wind. The forest was unnaturally silent, as if even the animals dared not make a sound. The trio moved cautiously, the path narrowing as the trees grew denser. The air was cold, each breath visible in the faint light filtering through the canopy. Chisholm gripped the charm in her hand tightly. Mama said we have to go beneath the earth, she murmured. How do we even find a way down? There are caves near the tree, Baba Kola said. They are old, forgotten even by the oldest among us. But the spirits know we are coming. As they approached the clearing, the oppressive hum returned. The tree loomed ahead, its branches twisted and gnarled like skeletal hands. The ground around it was cracked, glowing faintly as if alive. Here, Baba Kola said, pointing to a fissure at the base of the tree. The crack was wide enough to crawl through, and the faint glow from the ground illuminated the path downward. This is where we begin. Namdi tested the rope, securing it to a nearby tree. I'll go first, he said. If it's stable, I'll signal. Baba Kola nodded. Be careful. The spirits will try to stop us. Namdi descended into the fissure, the rope creaking under his weight. Chisholm watched nervously as he disappeared into the shadows. Moments later, his voice echoed up. It's clear. Come down slowly. Chisholm followed, her heart pounding as she gripped the rope. The descent was steep, the air growing colder with each step. When she reached the bottom, Namdi helped her to her feet. Baba Kola was the last to descend, his walking stick slung over his back. The cavern was vast, its walls glowing faintly with the same eerie light. Strange, twisted roots ran along the walls, pulsating as though alive. The air was thick with an unnatural hum that vibrated through their bodies. This is the heart of their domain, Baba Kola said, his voice low. Be vigilant. The spirits will not let us proceed easily. The path through the cavern twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the earth. The glow grew brighter and the hum louder as they approached the center. Along the way, they encountered grotesque shapes embedded in the walls, faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain, their mouths open in silent screams. These are the trapped souls, Baba Kola said grimly. Those who have failed the spirits' tests. They are neither alive nor at rest. Chisholm shuddered, her grip on the charm tightening. We can't let that happen to us. As they pressed on, the cavern opened into a massive chamber. In the center stood a pool of black, viscous liquid, its surface swirling as though stirred by an invisible hand. Above the pool, the twisted roots converged, forming a grotesque mass that pulsed with a sickly light. That must be the source, Namdi said, his voice low. The spirit's power flows from it. Baba Kola nodded. If we destroy it, the bond will break. But be ready. The spirits will fight us. As if in response to his words, the air grew colder, and the hum turned into a low, menacing growl. The shadows around the chamber began to shift, taking on shapes that moved with purpose. They know we're here, Chisholm whispered. The shadowy figure from the ritual emerged, its glowing red eyes fixed on them. You dare trespass in our domain, it hissed. You are fools. We are here to end this, Baba Kola said, planting his walking stick firmly on the ground. Your grip on our village ends today. The figure laughed, a sound that echoed through the chamber. You think you can destroy us? We are eternal. You will join the others, trapped forever in our grasp. The shadows surged forward, coiling like serpents. Namdi swung his machete, cutting through the darkness, but the tendrils reformed instantly. Baba Kola began to chant, his voice resonating through the chamber. The shadows recoiled slightly, but the figure only grew more menacing. You cannot stop us, it said. The girl belongs to us. Chisholm stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. You've taken enough from us. My mother gave her life to save the village. You won't take mine. The figure snarled, its red eyes flaring. Then you will die. The chamber erupted into chaos. The shadows lashed out, their cold tendrils wrapping around Namdi and pulling him toward the pool. He struggled, his machete slashing wildly, but the grip was too strong.
Help him,
Chisholm shouted. Baba Kola raised his walking stick, slamming it into the ground. The roots trembled, and the shadows loosened their grip. Namdi broke free, scrambling back as the pool began to churn violently. Chisholm turned to Baba Kola. What do we do? He pointed to the massive roots above the pool. That is the source. Destroy it, and their power will crumble. Without hesitation, Chisholm ran toward the pool, dodging the lashing shadows. Namdi followed, hacking at the tendrils that tried to block their path. Baba Kola's chants grew louder, his voice straining as the spirits fought back. When Chisholm reached the edge of the pool, she hesitated. The mass of roots was high above, its pulsating light almost blinding. How do I destroy it? She shouted. The charm, Baba Kola called. Use it as a weapon. Chisholm clutched the charm in her hand, her resolve hardening. She took a deep breath and leapt onto one of the roots, climbing toward the mass. The shadows screamed around her, but she didn't stop. When she reached the center, the charm in her hand began to glow. She raised it high, driving it into the heart of the roots. The mass shuddered violently, and the chamber was filled with an ear-splitting roar. The shadows recoiled, and the pool began to boil. The figure screamed, its form dissolving into the air. The roots crumbled, and the pulsating light faded. The chamber trembled as the spirit's power unraveled. Chisholm leapt back down, landing beside Namdi as the cavern began to collapse. We have to go, she shouted. The three of them ran, the ground shaking beneath their feet. The walls cracked, and the faces of the trapped souls dissolved into mist. The hum grew fainter until it disappeared entirely. When they finally emerged from the fissure, the forest was silent. The oppressive air was gone, replaced by the fresh scent of earth and leaves. The tree, once twisted and alive, now stood as a lifeless husk. It's over, Baba Kola said, his voice filled with awe. The spirits are gone. Chisholm fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She could feel her mother's presence, faint but peaceful, like a soft breeze on her skin. Thank you, Mama, she whispered. We're free. The village was safe, but the memory of what had happened would linger forever. The walk back to the village was filled with a heavy silence. Though the spirits were gone, the weight of their actions lingered on their hearts. Chisholm, Namdi, and Baba Kola emerged from the forest to find the entire village waiting for them at the edge of the square. The villagers, who had watched the forest for any sign of their return, erupted into murmurs and tears of relief when they appeared. You've returned, a woman cried, rushing forward with her child in tow. Are we safe now? Baba Kola raised his hand, silencing the crowd. His voice carried across the square with the authority of his years. The spirits are gone. The bond has been broken. The tree, and the power it held, no longer binds us. The villagers let out a collective sigh of relief, but their joy was tempered by the haunted look in Chisholm's eyes. Namdi stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Chisholm was the one who finished it, he said. Her courage saved us all. The villagers turned their attention to her, their gratitude evident, but Chisholm only felt the ache of loss. I didn't do it alone, she said quietly. My mother gave everything to protect this village. I only did what she would have wanted. Baba Kola nodded solemnly. Adan's spirit guided us, and her sacrifice will not be forgotten. We owe her our lives. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding, not just of huts and farms, but of the villagers' spirits. The forest, once feared and avoided, became a place of cautious curiosity. Though the shadows were gone, the memories of the spirits' reign lingered. Chisholm spent her days helping where she could, but her nights were restless. She still dreamed of her mother, though the visions were no longer frightening. Instead, they were comforting, a reminder that Adan's spirit watched over her, free from the torment of the spirits. One night, as she sat outside her hut staring at the stars, Baba Kola joined her. He lowered himself onto a nearby stool, his walking stick resting across his lap. You have been quiet, he said. Chisholm nodded, her gaze fixed on the sky. I keep thinking about her, she said. About what she gave up for all of us. Baba Kola's eyes softened. Your mother's love was strong, stronger than the spirits themselves. Her sacrifice was not in vain. Because of her, you live. And because of you, the village has hope again. Chisholm turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears. Do you think she's at peace now? Baba Kola smiled faintly. I have no doubt. She stands with the ancestors now, watching over you with pride. Months passed, and life in the village slowly returned to normal. The forest, though no longer a place of fear, was treated with reverence. The villagers planted new trees near the clearing where the cursed tree had stood, hoping to replace the darkness with life. Chisholm found a new sense of purpose. She spent her days teaching the children the lessons she had learned, not just about the spirits, but about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of respecting the old ways. She wanted them to remember what had happened, not as a tale of fear, but as a story of resilience. Namdi, who had become a close friend and protector, often joined her. Together, they spoke of the future, of how the village could thrive without the shadow of the spirits looming over them. But the memory of the spirits was not erased completely. The villagers built a small shrine near the edge of the forest, a place to honor Adan's sacrifice and to remind themselves of the dangers of ignoring the balance between the living and the unseen world. Chisholm visited often, leaving offerings of flowers and fruit, her silent prayers carrying her love and gratitude to her mother. One evening, as the sun set over the village, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Chisholm stood at the shrine. She placed a small bundle of fresh palm leaves on the altar, her hands trembling slightly. I hope you're proud, Mama, she whispered. We're safe now. The village is safe. And it's because of you. A soft breeze rustled the leaves around her, warm and gentle, as if in response. Chisholm closed her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. For the first time in months, her heart felt light. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of the forest. The trees swayed in the wind, their shadows long and peaceful. The spirits were gone, and the village would never be the same. But they would endure. Chisholm walked back to the village, the stars beginning to the sky above her. She carried her mother's strength in her heart, her courage in her steps, and her hope for a brighter future in her soul. The story of the spirits would be told for generations, not as a tale of fear, but as a lesson in resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child.